Lesson 61. As we mentioned in the previous lesson, this word can be spelled two ways. It can be estine with a nu at the end, or it could just be esti without the nu at the end. It depends on what the next word starts with.
And so once we have that spelling variation kind of down, one of the things to pay attention to with estine is the fact that it doesn't mean just is. Like in English, we have a separate word is, and then in order to indicate what or who we're talking about, we need a pronoun like he is, she is, it is, something like that. We need a separate word. But for this word, we don't need a separate word. The word itself, estine, has either he or she or it embedded in it, depending on the context that surrounds it.
The word ami has the word I embedded in it. It's just part of the word.
Mm-hmm.
And the word which means you are, it has the word you embedded in it. You don't have to explicitly say you. It's just part of the word.
Mm-hmm.
And so same thing with this verb. It includes the idea of he or she or it.
Right. And there's no change in the form of the word, whether it's he or whether it's she or whether it's it. It's always going to be esti, estine, no matter what the subject's gender is.
And it can also just simply mean is.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to talk about that. Let's talk about how to translate this word if you see it in a text. And I think the easiest way to explain this is just to look at our examples.
Mm-hmm.
We have a couple of example sentences here. The first one is georgos estin. Now, at first glance, you might think that the word georgos is the subject of the sentence. You might think it says a farmer is. But as we said a moment ago, estin can mean he is, she is, or it is. So in a sentence like this, you have to think of the pronoun that's included in the verb. And so we'll translate estine as he is or she is, and then georgos says farmer. So really the sentence says he is a farmer, and georgos is not the subject. The subject of the sentence really is he.
Right, but in Greek, we don't need that separate pronoun he to be the subject. It's just embedded in the verb.
Right. You don't have to explicitly say who the sentence is talking about.
And a lot of Greek sentences that involve estine are this way. They may not have an explicit stated subject. The subject may be embedded in the verb.
Now let's compare that to our next example, Alexandros esti georgos. In this example sentence, the subject is explicitly stated. The subject here is Alexandros, and so the sentence reads, Alexander is a farmer. Now you could translate esti here as he is. You could say, Alexander, he is a farmer. And that's fine if you're a student just starting out. It makes perfect sense. That's the way we've told you to translate it. But if you're translating into good English, you don't need to have the pronoun he there. So you could just say, Alexander is a farmer.
And this is one of those things that in translation, you just have to develop a sense of what sounds good in English, yet reflects the Greek.
So here's the big takeaway, the big point that I would like our readers and listeners to get here is that when you're working with the verb estine, you need to figure out whether or not to pay attention to the pronoun that's embedded in that verb. Will you translate it as he is, or will you translate it simply as is? That's the big thing I want people to examine, is how to handle that verb.
Yeah, that's the big concept in this lesson.
If there's an explicitly stated subject, you can just translate it as is. If there's not an explicitly stated subject, like if there's not a separate word to be the subject of the sentence, you have to use the pronoun that's embedded in the word esti.
Now, one thing that our listeners may be running into is, how do you distinguish if there are two words with estin, for example, how do you distinguish which is the subject and which is the thing being said about the subject? So what if we have Alexandros philosophos estin, like in our third example sentence? How do we tell what the subject is since it's not in English word order?
As you get more advanced in ancient Greek, you're going to learn more about syntax and about how the arrangement of words can have a bit more of a subtle meaning. For example, the use of the definite article, different subtle word orders you can use. They'll learn something in the future. They'll learn something called the attributive position and the predicate position. And so in the future, they'll learn more about those subtleties.
Mm-hmm.
But for now, just as beginners, we're giving them these extremely basic sentences to start with. And so for these very simple sentences, I would say that word order can suggest that the fact that Alexandros is first could suggest that it's the subject. And then with the word philosophos parked next to estin, you can take those two words together as a unit and say, Alexander is a philosopher.
Definitely.
So this is a simple sentence for beginners. And then as you get more advanced, you'll learn more of the subtleties of Greek word order, especially if you get more into Attic Greek. That is the kind of Greek associated with ancient Athens, what we might call classical Greek. If you're reading New Testament Greek, you'll see probably lots of sentences like this. If you're reading Attic Greek, you'll have to learn about some of the more subtle ways to express meaning. But this is a great sentence to start with as a beginner.
Right. And one of the key things with this textbook is not to overthink the exercises, since they are meant for beginners and they are meant to be simple.
One other thing to notice here is that estin is an enclitic. We notice that ami is an enclitic, and we notice that which means you are, is not an enclitic, so it's going to hang on to its accent. But the word estin is, in fact, an enclitic, so it wants to give away its accent to the previous word. And so you can see that here in the sentence, Alexandros philosophos estin. You can see that the word estin has no accent. It's given it away to the word philosophos. And in fact, philosophos now has two accents.
Right. It has its first accent, which is its natural accent. And then it has an extra accent, which is really the accent from estin, but estin gave it away to philosophos.
So because estin is an enclitic, it has joined with the previous word for the sake of syllable counting. That is, for counting the number of syllables in the syllable unit. Philosophos and estin, for that particular purpose, are now one unit.
Mm-hmm.
And so teen is the final syllable of the syllable counting unit. S is the next to last. And then phos is third to last. And for any syllable counting unit, you must have an accent on one of those last three syllables.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why we have the accent on phos. But then philosophos already had an accent on its second syllable.
And since it's far enough back, we have to have another accent on the end of philosophos.
And so philosophos ends up with two accents. If we pronounce philosophos and estin as one unit, as it ought to be, it sounds like this. Philosophos estin.
So you went up twice in philosophos because there are two accents.
And so that's an example of how enclitics can change the flow of the pronunciation. Quick review before we go on to the exercises. When you're working with the verb estin, it includes the pronouns he, she, and it. So if there is no separate word to be the subject of the sentence, you'll need to figure out how you're going to use the pronoun that's embedded in that word. You might have to put the word he or she or it in your translation. But if there is a separate noun that is functioning as the subject of the sentence, you don't need to put in the word he or she or it. because that word is the subject. So, Catherine, let's take them through a few of these exercises, and hopefully that can give them some good practice working with these new concepts. In number 1, we have a separate noun that is functioning as the subject of the sentence, and that's Alexandros. So the sentence is saying that Alexander is a teacher. That's the meaning of the sentence. And so Alexandros is the subject, esti is the verb, and didaskalos is what we call a predicate nominative. That's the thing you're saying that someone is. So Alexander is a teacher. And so we don't need to translate esti as he is. We don't need to say, Alexander, he is a teacher, because there's already a separate word being the subject of the sentence. The subject is explicitly stated.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't need to translate the pronoun that is embedded in esti. And so esti can just mean is.
Right.
And so the sentence reads, Alexander is a teacher.
Similarly, in exercise 2, telemachos iatros estin. Again, we have an explicit subject, telemachos. And so the sentence means Telemachus is a doctor. And even though estin is at the end of the sentence and telemachos and iatros are right next to each other, we still have the fact that telemachos is the subject and iatros is, again, what we call the predicate nominative. It's what we're saying Telemachus is. So here, again, it's not Telemachus, he is a doctor. It's Telemachus is a doctor. We don't need the pronoun.
One quick note about accents before we go. Notice that in exercise 1, the word esti gave away its accent to the previous word. So Alexandros has its accent on its second syllable, but then esti gave away its accent to Alexandros, and that ends up on the final syllable of the word. So it sounds like Alexandros esti. That syllable counting unit consists of both the word Alexandros and the word esti. They're joined together into one syllable counting unit. And so ros, the final syllable of Alexandros, that is the third syllable from the end in that syllable counting unit. So that's where the accent ends up there. Also in number 2, estin gave away its accent to iatros, which is the previous word. Iatros already had an accent there, so it just keeps the accent in the same place, and it sounds like iatros estin. So a little more practice there with observing the way enclitics give away their accents to the previous word.